Well, hello, fellow teachers, and welcome to Teaching with Power. I'm Ben Wilcox, and I want to thank you for joining me today. We're slowly but steadily working our way through the Doctrine and Covenants, and I pray that your faith in the Restoration and Joseph Smith and the church has been strengthened each week that we've studied and prepared and taught. And I know that mine has. And this week we're going to be looking at Doctrine and Covenants, sections 85 through 87. So it's a shorter week, sandwiched between two huge weeks. Sections 84 and 88 both have at least 9 pages of text to cover, while these 3 sections, in the middle, collectively really only cover 3. Still, these sections are great, and there are definitely some worthwhile principles for us to discuss. So if you're ready, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. So as an icebreaker, I like to ask my students where they think they might find their names written. In what places or books could they find it? Some possible answers: a yearbook, the phone book, although most of the younger generation probably won't even know what that is, the Church Tools app that has their ward directory, in a teacher's roll book of a class that they're taking, a government census, on a social media account. There are many places that we might find our names recorded. Well, Section 85 talks about a place where you definitely want to find your name written. It's absolutely essential to our exaltation that we find our names written there. Where is it? See if you can find it. There's actually more than one correct answer in Section 85. You may have seen it at the end of verse 3, where it talks about having your name enrolled with the people of God. Verse 5 talks about having your name written in the book of the law of God. So does verse 7 and verse 11 as well. And then verse 9 gives us another name for the book, as it speaks about all they who are not found written in the book of remembrance. What's this all referring to? Well, back in Joseph Smith's day, there actually was a journal kept by leaders of the church called the Book of the Law of God that was used to record the names and offerings and worthiness of those who were righteously striving to live the law of consecration as they'd been instructed by church leaders. Unfortunately, there were members of the church who had settled in Zion without official authorization to do so, and who were not willing to live the law of consecration as instructed by the church. There were also some who had initially made the commitment to live it and had received their inheritances, but then had backed out of those commitments, or they'd completely apostatized from the church. So now leaders in the church in Zion, like William W. Phelps, wondered how they should deal with these kinds of situations. Section 85 was the Lord's answer to that question. The church clerk in Zion was instructed to keep a record of the faithful. Those that were willing to live God's laws would have their names enrolled with the people of God. Those that refused to live God's laws, or who apostatized from the church, would have their names removed from that record. And in Joseph Smith's day, the Book of the Law of God was an actual journal of that name kept by church leaders. Now, it's not quite the same today, but I'm sure you know that the church does continue to maintain accurate records of church members, ordinances, and donations. There is a physical list out there of those who call themselves members of Christ's church. We could refer to this as a modern-day Book of the Law of God. That's a place that we most definitely want to find our name. Now, in this section, I usually don't like to spend a lot of time going verse by verse and really delving into each phrase. It's a bit of a harsher section, and I usually only give a brief summary like the one that I just shared. In fact, if you had to sum up the major message of Section 85 in just one sentence, I would say, if we refuse to live God's laws, our names will not be found among the records of the righteous. That seems to be the basic gist of it. Where I would spend some time, though, would be verse 8, which references a very interesting story from the Old Testament. Verse 8 says, while that man who was called of God and appointed, that putteth forth his hand to steady the ark of God, shall fall by the shaft of death, like as a tree that is smitten by the vivid shaft of lightning. Wow, what's he talking about here? Somebody is getting a pretty stern warning, aren't they? Many historians and members over the years have debated the identity of that man, as well as the identity of the one mighty and strong from verse 7 that was meant to set in order the house of God. Sadly, verse 7 has sometimes been used by apostate leaders and groups to justify opposing the prophet or breaking away from the church. Now, I prefer the interpretation offered by an official statement issued by the First Presidency all the way back in 1905 when Joseph F. Smith was the prophet, that identifies the man called of God and appointed as Edward Partridge, who apparently had begun to resolve some of these concerns in his own way, perhaps in opposition to Joseph's instructions. And the one mighty and strong as being a person who would replace him if he continued to act of his own accord. Thankfully, Edward Partridge did heed the prophet's warning and counsel, and no such measures were needed. If you're interested in reading that explanation, I'll provide it briefly here, but also place it in the video description below. I'm not sure, though, that I'd go into all of that as a teacher. I would want my students to understand what the scriptures mean by steadying the ark. Steadying the ark is one of the things that could possibly cause our names to be removed from the book of the law of God. But what does it mean to steady the ark? First, we need to know the source material, the story from the Old Testament itself, which is found in 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 13. But I usually just summarize it. Since this story is such an interesting one, I usually just like to let my students react to it. So here it goes. In ancient Israel, the Ark of the Covenant was the sacred container of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, received by Moses on Mount Sinai. And it rested in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle and represented the very presence of God. If they've ever seen the Indiana Jones movies, they'll know what you're talking about. But nobody was permitted to touch the ark, and only the Levites were authorized to even carry it. And that was only with sticks that were attached by rings to the outer corners. Even they weren't permitted to touch the actual ark itself. Well, at this time in Israelite history, King David has decided to move the ark to Jerusalem. Remember, his son Solomon is going to build a temple there. And the ark is placed on a cart drawn by oxen, and a man named Uzzah is walking alongside it. Well, as they're walking, the cart passes over a rut or a pothole, and it shakes the ark. Well, Uzzah, when he sees this, reaches out his hand to steady the ark, worried that it might fall. But as soon as he touches the ark, zap! He falls over dead. The end. And that's the story. Now, what do you do with that? I ask my students, what do you think about that? Was that fair? And my students are often shocked by the story, pun intended. And they protest, but he was just trying to help. That seems way too harsh. Why would God do that to somebody? The punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. Well, I explained to them that there's one conclusion that they shouldn't come to from this story. The lesson is not that God is a capricious and vengeful God, just waiting to strike dead those who don't happen to do what he likes. There's too many other stories in the scriptures that refute that conclusion. We know that God is loving, that he's forgiving, and he's merciful. So if that's not the conclusion, what is the moral of the story? Well, I believe that God wished to make a very important point with the story of Uzzah. Don't steady my ark. I don't need man to keep my affairs in order. I'm well able to take care of my things. I don't need man's puny arm to manage the things of my kingdom. Instruction and counsel comes from the top down and not vice versa. That's what we mean by steadying the ark. President David O. McKay had this to say about that story. However well-meaning his intentions, Uzzah approached casually what could only be approached under the strictest conditions. He had no faith in God's power. He assumed that the ark was in danger, forgetting that it was the physical symbol of the God who has all power. What man can presume to save God and his kingdom through his own efforts? In modern revelation, the Lord referred to this incident to teach the principle that the Lord does not need the help of men to defend his kingdom. Yet even today, there are those who fear the ark is tottering and presume to steady its course. These are ark steadiers. The best intentions don't justify such interference with the Lord's plan. I personally believe the Lord acted in this way to give us a strong visual to help us to remember that principle. Uzzah gave us such a great and memorable phrase. The scriptures tend to deal in extreme stories, so that all other similar type situations of a lesser nature will fall under that same principle. Steadying the ark is going to be a phrase that's going to help a lot of future disciples beware of making the same kind of error. Now, I'm kind of joking here, but perhaps even God and Uzzah had a good laugh about it afterwards. I could just see him up there afterwards saying, "Thank you, Uzzah, for letting me use your life as a powerful object lesson to all the members of my church for the rest of time." And Uzzah might say, "Don't mention it, Lord, any time." And the story has added power in the very fact that Uzzah was well-intentioned. If he had pridefully reached out or was deliberately looking for an opportunity to do so that he could boast about it later, well, in that case, the lesson would be completely different. But I believe that Uzzah sincerely was trying to help. So to liken the scriptures, can you think of any possible examples of ark steadying in today's world, in the modern church? Well, perhaps there are members of the church who vocally voice their opinion that they feel the church is getting things wrong. They're not up to date with their policies on social issues or administrative matters. Some may voice their disapproval of the church's handling of women's issues, LGBTQ policies, abortion, marijuana use, sexual health, or the way the church manages its financial affairs. Perhaps there are people who feel the church is tipping and needs their help to right it. On a more local level, perhaps they complain about the decisions or the actions of their bishop, their Relief Society president, their youth leaders. I believe that in most cases these members are indeed well-intentioned. And I'm not saying that this feedback is always totally inappropriate. Sometimes leaders can use counsel and benefit from critique and relevant information that they might have missed. Leaders aren't perfect. But the spirit in which it's offered can make all the difference. If it's offered as something for leaders to consider in the spirit of constructive criticism or information, then I think that can be appropriate and helpful at times. But if it's a blatant declaration of wrongdoing, or a demand for change, or a public outcry of disapproval to everybody around them, then that's ark steadying. And sadly, these individuals who rise up to steady the ark do often die. Now, it's not that God strikes them physically dead, like with Uzzah, but they often end up separating themselves from the church, or they lose faith, or they get offended and drift into inactivity. I know of a fellow seminary teacher who began to criticize some of the brethren's statements and church policies. He eventually not only removed himself from church education, but from the church itself. He allowed his political opinions on just a few topics topple his entire testimony. His ark steadying was his downfall. And he died, in a sense. His faith died. His commitment died. And this is so often the fate of ark steadiers. And as a result, their names are removed from the records of the church, often at their own request. And that, I'm afraid, is one of the saddest responsibilities that I've had as a bishop. On a few occasions, I've received a letter from the church informing me that a member of my ward has requested to have their names removed from the records of the church. And how sad it is to have to follow through on that instruction. Another example of ark steadying would be when people decide that they're going to live the gospel or the commandments in their own way, on their own terms, rather than God's. They want the benefits of obedience and discipleship without all the responsibilities that go with it. Now, if I want to get my driver's license, then I've got to meet certain specific criteria or they won't give me one. If I want to travel on an airplane, I can't just decide that I'm going to skip airport security because it's such a hassle. I've got to follow their instructions if I want the benefit of getting to where I want to go. It's the same with commandments. Some may feel that they should be able to attend the temple without being full tithe payers. Some may feel that they should be able to perform ordinances for family members when they're clearly not living a worthy lifestyle. Some may say that they don't think that drinking coffee is that big of a deal, or wearing clothing incompatible with temple garments, or using dishonest business practices to get ahead in their industry. In the long run, that strategy just isn't going to work. I'm afraid that the adversary will just continue to push them little by little, further and further, until they've drifted far from the safety of the iron rod. Something dies when we decide to steady the ark and do things our own way. And Jesus warned that he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. And we might say an ark steadier. Instead of relying on our own wisdom, we can rely on God's instead. So the truth here, when I seek to counsel God or his appointed leaders, I put myself in danger of spiritual death. And a personal question to ponder. Are there any areas in my life where I am seeking to steady the ark? And what can I do instead? Well, I hope that we can all avoid the dangers of ark steadying. I've unfortunately seen this kind of scenario play out on more occasions than I wish to admit. And so I invite us to be very careful about fault finding and criticizing the way that God runs his universe and his kingdom. Let's steady ourselves rather than steadying the ark. If we do, then one day there'll be a roll call of sorts, where God calls out the names of those recorded in his book of remembrance, or the book of his law. How upsetting would it be not to hear our names called out among the registers of the righteous? I had a bit of an experience like this myself when I graduated from high school. The ceremony was held on the school's football field, and they'd begun to read out the names of the graduates, and they'd gotten about halfway through when these dark storm clouds started to gather overhead. And it wasn't too long before a deafening crack and a blinding flash of light ripped through the crowd. And then, oh my gosh, there was chaos. People were running for cover, shouting and crying. Someone had actually been struck by lightning on the field. Thankfully, we discovered later that they were okay and that they were recovering. But since my name was Wilcox, I never got to hear my name called out as a graduate. The ceremony was canceled, and I was instructed to just pick up my diploma from the front office later that week. And I remember how disappointed I was that I never got to hear my name read out. I definitely don't want that to be the case when the celestial roll call is made. And it's my hope and prayer that we may all hear our names lovingly declared from the Lord's lips on that day. Section 86. As an icebreaker, I have a picture riddle for you. And this picture represents a word that describes something that we're going to talk about today. And if you want to try to figure it out on your own, you could go ahead and pause the video. But I'm going to go ahead and start giving hints to see if they'll help you. So hint number 1 is Jesus. Hint number 2, Doctrine and Covenants, section 86. Hint number 3, stories. And then hint number 4, the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the 10 virgins, the sower, the talents. And hopefully that was enough for you to get it. But the word riddle is parables, right? See, it's a pair of bowls. You get it? I know. You'll probably get a few groans if you do this as a teacher. But it is a fun way to introduce the concept of parables to your students. Now, if you don't like that idea, here's an alternate one. You can tell your students that you're going to be interpreting a parable and looking for a spiritual lesson that it teaches. To get them into the right frame of mind and give them some practice, give them this parable matching handout. And they're going to match the parable with the lesson that it teaches. And here are the answers really quickly. The Good Samaritan teaches us, C, serve your fellow man. The prodigal son teaches, B, we can be forgiven. Number 3, the parable of the 10 virgins teaches, A, be prepared for the second coming. The parable of the talents teaches, E, learn and improve yourself in this life. And the parable of the sower teaches, D, accept the gospel and be blessed. Well, today we're going to take a look at one of the parables of Jesus. And a parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. Ambiguous and abstract gospel principles are often more effectively communicated or felt through the use of parables. And parables will usually use symbols to represent different gospel elements or types of people. And when his apostles asked why Jesus taught in parables, he said, "Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand." So parables require a certain degree of spiritual readiness in order to grasp their deeper meanings. You have to ponder a parable in order to get it. The hard-hearted or the slothful listener is likely to only hear a story, while the careful listener is going to find deeper meaning and inspiration in them. Well, Doctrine and Covenants 86 is going to help us to interpret one of the parables of Jesus. And remember that Joseph Smith is working through his inspired version of the Bible at this time. And the section heading tells us that this revelation was received while the prophet was reviewing and editing the manuscript of the translation of the Bible. So whenever I encounter a parable in the Scriptures, I like to follow 3 basic steps in an attempt to interpret it. And they are, 1, list the elements of the parable. 2, identify what they may represent. 3, ponder spiritual application. So we're going to go ahead and do that for the parable of the wheat and the tares. But we first need to hear the parable. It isn't found here in section 86, so we're going to have to get it from the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. So what I'll usually do is either have one of my students read the parable, or I'll play an audio version of it out loud. And the church's scripture app or its website has always got that option available for you. So as they listen to it, ask them to listen for the different elements of the parable, and then go ahead and list those on the board. And I've already gone ahead and done that for you. Here are what I see as the elements of the parable. So now let's move on to the second step of the process. Identify what these elements represent. This is where section 86 can help us. It's going to give us the interpretation for at least a few of the symbols. What are the interpretations that the Lord gives us here? And how would you interpret the others that he doesn't? You're going to find some of the answers here in verses 2 through 3, but you could also go to Matthew 13, verses 36 to 43 as well. Here are the interpretations. The field is the world. The seed is the gospel. The sowers of the seed are the apostles. the enemy, is the great persecutor, the apostate, the whore, Babylon, or Satan. The wheat then, and you've got to go to Matthew 13 for these, the wheat then is the righteous people of the earth, or the children of the kingdom, while the tares are the children of the wicked one. So basically the righteous and the wicked. And the burning of the field is the end of the world, or the second coming, where the righteous are going to be preserved while the wicked are destroyed and the earth purified. Now that's a fairly straightforward description of the latter days and the second coming. We've got wicked people and righteous people all growing and living together. Satan, our enemy, has done a really good job of sowing wickedness and persecution, apostasy, and the influence of Babylon all around us. But eventually the second coming is going to arrive, and the righteous will be spared while the wicked destroyed. Pretty simple, right? But there's a lot more to this parable. To me, the real value, and where you find the personal application of the section, comes in the specific harvesting instructions that you find in verses 6 and 7. What are those instructions? In verse 6, we're warned not to pluck up the tares too quickly, for fear that some of the wheat might be destroyed in the process. And then in verse 7, we are to wait until they're fully ripe. And first, we gather out the wheat from the tares, so that then the tares can be bound and burned. And that's actually a change from the biblical version and that explanation. In the Bible, it's gather the tares first from out of the wheat. Now, what on earth is that all about? What do you think the Lord is trying to teach us with those instructions? Well, first, apparently it's not always easy to tell the difference between a stalk of wheat and a tare. And that's actually true of these plants. A tare is a type of weed, probably a darnel weed. If you were to just harvest your field with tares in it and try to bake bread out of the resulting flour that you got, it would taste terrible. Right? So you can't just leave them together. At some point, they need to be separated. Here's a picture of an immature stalk of wheat and an immature tare. They look really similar, don't they? It'd be very difficult to tell the difference with any degree of certainty. Now, here's what they look like when they're full grown. Now you can tell the difference, can't you? But remember, we're not talking about plants here, but people. What is this teaching us in terms of people? Why would he say, don't pull out what you think looks like a tare and burn it too quickly? The warning is that there may be people out there that look like tares on the outside, but really deep down on the inside, they're a piece of wheat. If we're too quick to pluck and burn them, we might actually be damaging wheat and losing their precious potential. To me, this is a lesson about not judging people too quickly. There are a lot of individuals out there that at first glance may not appear to be wheat. But before we condemn them to the fire, before we judge them as not being church material, before we deem them as a hopeless spiritual cause, give them a chance. Give them some more time to grow. Continue to work with them. If we just start pulling and burning, we might make a grave error. I mean, it says right there that our faith is weak. Or in other words, our judgment of a person's potential may not be that reliable. Do you remember Jacob 5 from last year, the allegory of the olive trees? How did the master of the vineyard work with his plants there? He tried everything in his power to get those plants to bring forth good fruit. He often said, "It grieveth me that I should lose this tree. Spare it a little longer." And then he works with them and nourishes them and digs about them and prunes them and all kinds of things. He was long-suffering and tried many different ways to try to save them before he ever got to the point of burning. And that's a really good illustration of how we should treat people. For example, my grandma Wilcox, if you were to meet her in her early 20s, you'd probably say that she looked very much like a tare. She was pretty wild back in those days when she was young. But if the people around her had pulled her out and burned her, if they'd lost hope in her, if they'd judged and condemned her, if they'd failed to give her a chance and encouragement to change, we may have lost one of the greatest stalks of wheat that I've ever met. In fact, my life may have turned out very differently as a result. My grandma was one of the most faithful, Christ-like, strong members of the church that I've ever known. She was a piece of wheat through and through. There was just a short time in her life when she kind of looked like a tare. Another brief example of a time when I made the mistake of judging a person as a tare. This is kind of a painful one for me to share. When I was serving my mission in Brazil, we met a young woman named Aparecida, who invited us in, and we taught her the gospel. She had 2 young boys, both from different fathers, and she was not living with either of them at the time. And we visited her a few times, and like good missionaries, challenged her to be baptized. And she said yes. Now, this is where I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't take her commitment that seriously, or as seriously as I should have. Unfortunately, I had had the experience many times already with people who accepted baptism, but then would never actually follow through with it. They would say yes to please us, but when it came right down to it, they'd eventually tell us that they weren't really interested, or they'd just never show up to church. And this kind of thing happened almost weekly. Perhaps I'd become a bit jaded. Well, I judged that young woman. In a sense, my weak in faith, 19-year-old mind had come to the conclusion that she was a tare, that she wasn't really the type of person that was serious about becoming a member of the church. But we continued to teach her, and when it came to the final discussion, we finished up and we were about to leave. But before we left, she looked up at us and she said, "So when's my baptism?" And I had that brief moment of surprise. And then I said, oh, of course, yes. We're planning on doing that this next Sunday, if you'd like. And she told us that she very much was looking forward to being baptized. And she was. Aparecida was baptized that week and began faithfully attending church from that point on. And I felt chastised by the Spirit after that experience. Don't judge, it seemed to say. In terms of Section 86, don't pluck out the tares lest you damage the wheat. Aparecida was wheat, and I judged her as a tare. Thankfully, the Lord wasn't going to allow my unfair judgment to get in the way of His work in the life of that young woman. Now, do you know of any examples of someone who you may have thought looked like a tare, but now you know that they actually turned out to be wheat? Now, since it's difficult to tell the difference, how are we to go about the work of gathering in the last days? Now look at verse 7. We go out looking for the wheat first. We gather the wheat to be bundled and saved, not going out looking for the tares to be burned. That's the change from Section 86 to the original interpretation found in the New Testament. And I think that's one of the reasons we have Section 86, because there is an actual explanation that Jesus gives in Matthew 13. How does that change things? To treat everyone as if they were wheat. To assume that regardless of their outside appearance, that they're really wheat on the inside. If we go out looking for tares, then we might bypass countless opportunities to bless and influence people. If we walk around saying things like, that person would never join the church. I mean, look at their lifestyle. They're a tare. What's the use in even trying? They drink and smoke. They have tattoos and piercings. They're too wrapped up in their own religion. Why even bother trying? If we have that attitude, at the worst, we're going to condemn them as hopeless and ignore them or make them our enemy. At best, we're going to miss out on opportunities to gather them. But if I treat everyone as a potential piece of wheat, then what could happen? They might change. Or at least they're going to know that they're welcome. They'll feel accepted. They'll be much more open to hear our message, maybe at some future time. Now, they may not be wheat in the end, but at least we've given them a chance. We've given them the benefit of the doubt. I really love this quote by Goethe that I feel applies here. Treat a man as he is, and he will remain as he is. Treat a man as he can and should be, and he will become as he can and should be. So to liken the scriptures, is there anyone you know of right now that on the outside looks like a tare? And how could you treat them more like wheat? Well, I hope that we can always assume that those we meet and know are wheat, even if they seem to bear a tare's facade. See the wheat in everyone. Never give up hope on them. Never make final judgments on people. You may very well be surprised someday to learn that they were wheat all along. Hopefully we can be humble enough to admit that our faith is weak and that we're not always the best judges of spiritual potential. I pray that we can all look for the best in people, and also that many of them can be gathered and bundled into the barn of the Lord. Now, there's another quick principle that I'd like to cover from the final verses of section 86. Verses 8 through 11 hold a powerful charge to members of the church. And as a teacher, I like to introduce this with a story of one of my ancestors. If you're teaching, I'd invite you to find and share a story of faith from your family history to share. Every family in the church has a pioneer story, regardless of whether it happened in 2019 or 1847. But there's a power in remembering and sharing these legacies of faith. One of my family's pioneer stories is that of Anne Massey Clegg, my great-great-great-grandmother on my mother's side. In the 1850s, she was living in Lancashire, England, as a widower struggling to raise 5 children all on her own. Gratefully, she encountered early missionaries of the church and was converted. But persecution quickly followed, and at one point, a mob even dropped a small bomb down her chimney, and 2 of her children were burned. She decided that she needed to find a better life for her children, and her greatest desire was to join with the saints in the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Fortunately, a wealthy convert in the area agreed to help pay for the passage of 5 families that were wanting to make the journey to Zion, and Anne's family was chosen. Their journey across the ocean and then the plains began to take its toll on Anne's already poor health. And eventually she became too weak to even walk and was only able to ride in the wagon. One thing kept her going: her wish to look upon Zion with her own eyes and assure that her children had safely arrived there. So when the wagon train reached the top of Emigration Canyon, her son lifted her head so that she could see down into the valley. And she uttered these 3 words: I am satisfied. Well, Anne Massey Clegg died just a few short weeks later, but not before providing her children with a better life and establishing them in Zion, where their faith could be nurtured and fortified. She was buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Generations later, our family found the records that showed where she was buried, and we placed a gravestone for her with the words, I am satisfied, engraved at the bottom. And whenever I hear that story, and others like it, it does something for me. It forges a link. It engenders a gratitude and awe. The legacy of that sacrifice has been passed from generation to generation, all the way from 1850 down to 2021. The burning torch of her faith has continued to kindle the faith of her descendants all the way to me. And I'll forever be grateful to her and my other ancestors who not only gave me my country, but also my faith. I wonder if they comprehended the impact that their decisions would have on so many generations to come. Well, Section 86 verses 8 through 11, speaks of the connection that we have with the pioneers of our faith. You're going to see words like lineage, fathers, and heirs in those verses. The Lord is reminding us of our heritage of faith. Now, he's going to zero in on one aspect of that faith, the priesthood. But I think that you could just as easily substitute the word gospel, faith, or truth there as well. It's the overall idea that's most powerful here. Our ancestors, from our own family pioneers all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were blessed with and embraced the priesthood, the gospel, the faith, truth. And they sacrificed for it, and they lived it, and they loved it. Now the Lord has a message and a charge for us. I want you to read those verses and ask yourself what you feel the Lord is asking us to do. Therefore, thus saith the Lord unto you, with whom the priesthood hath continued through the lineage of your fathers. For ye are lawful heirs, according to the flesh, and have been hid from the world with Christ in God. Therefore, your life and the priesthood have remained, and must needs remain through you and your lineage until the restoration of all things spoken by the mouths of the holy prophets since the world began. Therefore, blessed are ye if ye continue in my goodness, a light unto the Gentiles, and through this priesthood, a Savior unto my people Israel. The Lord hath said it. Amen. Did you catch the message? If not, let me point out a few phrases here. Your life and the priesthood have remained and must needs remain through you and your lineage. And blessed are ye if ye continue in my goodness. The message is that we need to continue that legacy of faith. It needs to remain in us and be passed on from generation to generation until the end of times when Christ returns. So one application here is that I need to remain strong. I don't want to be the weak link in the chain of that faith. I don't want to break it or have that legacy end in me. It must needs remain. Another application is that of teaching and influencing the next generation. One of my greatest desires and hopes is that I'll be able to successfully pass that legacy of faith on to my children and my grandchildren. It's also a source of anxiety, too. Will I be able to pass that legacy of faith on? Will they receive it and continue faithful and then pass it on to their children? I spoke earlier of my grandma Wilcox. There's another vivid memory that I have of her, something that she was very fond of saying to us. She'd say, "All I want is 100%. That's it." That was her way of saying that she wanted all of her children and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to remain true to the faith. All she wanted was what I would call an 86er family, or a must-needs-remain family. A family where the gospel and that legacy of faith has been lovingly passed on from one generation to the next. And I'm happy to report that as of now, her wish is being fulfilled. And I pray constantly that it will continue to be fulfilled. Of course, there's a caution here. People and children will exercise their agency, and a wayward child is not an indicator of failure or a lack of faith or effort on the part of the parents. Sometimes children stray or leave the path completely, and all we can do is continue to love and encourage and hope for them. We never know when they may return. And we may not be able to choose for them, but hopefully we make every effort to pass the torch and to keep it burning brightly in our own hearts. One of the things that I feel helps us to do this is to read those stories of faith and share them with our children. The Anne Massey Clegg stories. Not only does our Father in heaven want us to engage in family history work so that we can perform ordinances for them, but so that we can learn from their examples too. So the truth, one of our greatest commissions as members of Christ's church is to strive to continue the legacy of faith passed on from our ancestors. So what kinds of things could you do to keep that chain strong? And what could you do to link yourself and your posterity more strongly to that heritage? So the message, don't break the chain. Continue in his goodness. Strive to be an 86er or to create an 86er family. To be a must-needs-remain disciple or a must-needs-remain family. There's a promise in that section if we do this. Blessed are ye if you continue in my goodness. And we can become saviors ourselves. We get to share that title with Christ. Now, it's saviors with a little s, but saviors nonetheless. Perhaps the most important people that we will ever save is ourselves and our families. And hopefully our efforts and concerns reflect that priority. I would hate to have to stand before my ancestors in the next life and try to explain to them why I broke the chain. How I would feel trying to explain to Anne Messy Clegg that living the gospel was just too hard or inconvenient for me in light of her sacrifice. No, I want to be able to thank her for the strength of her conviction and joyfully report that I kept the faith strong, that I forged an unbreakable link between her and my posterity. Section 87. I'm afraid that the icebreaker for Section 87 is a little discouraging. I like to begin with a multiple choice question. We just talked about the parable of the wheat and the tares and how the wicked will be destroyed at the second coming. And so I ask, according to the Scriptures, what is the major way in which the wicked will be destroyed in the last days? Natural disasters, war, plagues and sickness, or famine? Now, all of these things do play a part in the prophecies and descriptions of the signs of the times. But one of them seems to stand out more prominently than all of the rest. It shows up and is emphasized in all of the great second coming revelations and books that we find in the Scriptures. It's in Daniel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, the book of Revelation, and in multiple places here in the Doctrine and Covenants. The answer is B, war. This appears to be the major cleansing element of the last days and second coming. It's not that God really has to send down a lot of destruction and burning from the heavens to punish and remove the wicked from the earth. No, it's the wicked that destroy themselves in war, while the righteous sit back and sadly look on. Maybe you've read the book of Revelation. You've been confused by what the Lord means by Armageddon, or the supper of the great God, or Gog and Magog, and vivid descriptions of beasts and destructions and burning. Well, if you want to simply understand what the Lord means by Armageddon, read section 87. This is the Cliff Notes version. It's the most straightforward and direct description that I know of. So section 87 is sometimes called the prophecy on war. And there's something really ironic about that you find in the section heading. See if you can find it. Irony is when there's an incongruity between what is expected and what actually happens or is expressed. Can you find a great example of irony here? And remember that this is the prophecy on war. The irony here is in the date. On what day was section 87 received? December 25th, Christmas. On the day that the world was celebrating peace on earth, goodwill towards men, Joseph received a prophecy on war. I'm not so sure that that was a coincidence. Maybe it was the Lord's way of saying that from this time forward, there would not be peace on earth or goodwill towards men. So I want you to read this section and answer the following 4 questions. You could either count off students from 1 to 4 and ask them to search for the answer to their question and then share it with the others. Or you could give them the small handout with all of the questions and invite them to search for the answers. So number 1, what specific war does Joseph Smith seem to be prophesying here in the first verses of the section? And the answer, this is Joseph Smith's prophecy of the Civil War. Now, this is in 1832, When did this civil war actually begin? Not until 1861, almost 30 years later. Now, it just so happens that at this very time in American history, there was a rebellion against the United States government in South Carolina called the Nullification Crisis. And surely that must have been on Joseph's mind as he's writing this. But the Lord uses this opportunity to help Joseph and the church understand something about the future. That war was coming. Now, that initial rebellion of South Carolina was shortly resolved in 1832. The current president, Andrew Jackson, was actually from the South and was able to shut down that uprising. And for a lot of years, critics of the church pointed to this as evidence that Joseph was a false prophet. See, they said, it didn't come true. The South Carolina thing fell apart. Joseph Smith's prophecies are a hoax. But Joseph stood by his prophecy and even reiterated it years later with even more specificity. You can see that in section 130, verses 12 through 13. He said, I prophesy in the name of the Lord God that the commencement of the difficulties which will cause much bloodshed previous to the coming of the Son of Man will be in South Carolina. It may probably arise through the slave question. This a voice declared to me while I was praying earnestly on the subject, December 25th, 1832. Now, it would still be nearly 20 years before that prophecy would be fulfilled. And sure enough, which state saw the very first battle of the Civil War? It was South Carolina. The first shots were fired at Fort Sumter near Charleston. Now, some may argue that many Americans during the time felt that there would someday be a conflict between the northern and southern states over slavery. It's not a huge revelation. But the fact that he was able to pinpoint and declare with such certainty, 20 years prior, the exact state that the conflict would begin in, really is something and should bring pause to even the most skeptical of critics. To me, it's just another point in a long line of evidences of Joseph Smith's prophetic calling. Number 2, is there any evidence that this section is speaking of more than just one specific war? The answer is yes. There's a lot of evidence that this is much more than just the American Civil War. This is a prophecy on the beginning of many wars. Notice in verse 1 that it says, Verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina. Then verse 2 says that the time will come when war is poured out upon all nations. How will all of that begin? It will begin, as already noted, with the rebellion of South Carolina. And then the southern states shall be divided against the northern states. Then the southern states would call upon Great Britain, all of which happened, and then war would be poured out on all nations. In other words, the American Civil War would mark the beginning of a new age of warfare, that the Civil War would be a starting point, an indication that the world had entered a new age, an age of war unlike anything previous. And is that true? Did the American Civil War mark a shift in warfare? And a simple Google search of the question, what is considered to be the first modern war, reveals the answer. Though there are a few historians that argue that it's World War I, the vast majority consider the American Civil War to be the first modern war. An increase in the accuracy of weapons and ironclad ships and other technological advances made the Civil War different from anything that had been fought before it. These innovations would result in massive casualties, unlike anything ever known. And from that time on, warfare has only increased in bloodiness and destruction. In fact, I believe that these verses even describe the different types of wars that were going to occur and will still occur in the future. So 1, the southern states being divided against the northern states. What kind of a war is that describing? That's a civil war. The United States isn't the only country to experience that type of war. Can you think of any others that have taken place since then? In recent memory, Korea, the former Yugoslavia, Uganda, Colombia, Sudan, and Syria are all examples of civil wars. Then what do we call a war that is poured out upon all nations? These are world wars, or what I'd call a war of alliance, where not only two nations are involved, but where allies join against allies and fight in massive theaters of war all over the globe. Examples of that kind of war? It's an easy one. World War I, World War II, and I'd even consider the modern war on terrorism another type of world war. And then we have verse 4. What kind of a war is that? When you have oppressed people who rise up against their oppressors to free themselves. That would be a rebellion or a revolutionary war. Can you think of any examples of that? Russia has seen that happen. India, a lot of African nations, Cuba, China, Nicaragua, many, many others. Joseph Smith's prophecy does a really good job at describing our world, doesn't it? Question number 3, what will be the final result of these wars? The results come in verse 6. These wars will usher in the signs and calamities of the last days that will eventually result in the full end of all nations. That's why I don't believe that Armageddon, described in the book of Revelation, is just one specific large land battle where all nations are fighting on a field in Israel. Although I suppose it's a possibility. But I don't think it's very likely. It's not really the way that we fight wars anymore. I believe that Armageddon is now. It's the conglomeration of all the bloody conflicts that have been and are being waged on the earth since the early 1800s. In fact, just right now, there are around 45 major or minor armed conflicts happening in the world. You can check this out on the following web address if you're interested. And also, here's a list of all the major wars that have been fought since the American Civil War. Certainly our world has seen a lot of bloodshed within the past 200 years. And along with those wars, we'll also see earthquakes and famines and thunderings and lightnings, both literal and spiritual, in the last days. But eventually, these wars will lead to a full end of all nations, like Daniel prophesied in his dream. And the only nation that will remain on earth will be the kingdom of God. Question number 4, our final question, and maybe the most important. This section has described the massive problem of war that we're going to face in the latter days. But I always keep in mind one of my favorite sayings that my students hear me repeat all the time. The scriptures will never present a problem without a solution being somewhere nearby. Well, there is a solution presented to us in section 87. What is it? It's found in verse 8. Wherefore, stand ye in holy places, and be not moved, until the day of the Lord come. For behold, it cometh quickly, saith the Lord. Amen. That's the solution. We've got to stand or make our stand in our holy places. That's a phrase that we've seen before in the Doctrine and Covenants, and we discussed it in depth back in section 45. But if you remember that discussion, you'll recall that we cross-referenced Isaiah 4, verses 5 through 6, for a description of the 3 major holy places of the latter days: our homes, our churches, and our temples. I know that for the longest time, I wondered why the church seemed to ask for so much of our time. Sunday church meetings, home-centered gospel learning, seminary, institute, temple worship, youth activities, general conferences, firesides, broadcasts, personal and family prayer, personal and family scripture study, and so on and so on. I think that at least part of the reason for that is because all of those things draw us into the safety of our holy places. The more time we spend in these places, the better off we'll be. The more protected and insulated we're going to be from the influence and conflicts of the world all around us. So the truth, if we wish to be safe from the conflicts of the last days, then we must make a stand in our holy places. And in what ways have you found refuge from the calamities of the last days in those 3 holy places? In conclusion, I'd like to share a really great literal example of this principle, and then a figurative one. We know how much of a tragedy it was for the early saints to be persecuted and pushed out of one place to another, from New York to Kirtland to Missouri and Nauvoo. Each time they were forced from their settlements and prodded elsewhere. Finally, after so many failed attempts to establish Zion among the people of the United States, they decided to go as far away from civilization as they could get, to leave their country and fundamentally all of civilization behind, and establish themselves in the valley of the Great Salt Lake, basically the middle of nowhere. And there they gathered for years and enjoyed relative peace and isolation from the nation that was growing up around them. One of the unforeseen results and blessings of this exodus was that when the Civil War actually does happen, as Joseph had prophesied here in 87, the saints are largely unaffected by that conflict, while the North and the South were tearing each other apart and causing incredible losses of life. The saints were quietly and peacefully planting their crops, raising their families, and living their faith. I believe that this will be the same kind of outcome for Armageddon. Evil will destroy evil, and all Zion will need to do is sit back and watch with great sadness. Keep one thing in mind, though. One might argue that there have been many members of the church who have fought in and died in all of these conflicts. Were they not righteous enough? That can't be it. I think the greatest war we face today is the battle between good and evil, faith and unbelief, righteousness and wickedness. Actual, literal war is just an outgrowth of this deeper, more fundamental war. So whether a soldier dies in actual conflict has no real bearing on the state of their soul and salvation. The way to win this war is to stand in holy places and be not moved. The righteous will all be brought forth in the morning of the first resurrection to enjoy the peace of the millennium, even those that may have died in physical wars and conflicts. The wicked destroy themselves through their actions, while the righteous walk away spiritually unscathed, that we may all find peace and protection within the safety of our holy places is my prayer. Well, thank you for joining me today. I always appreciate you spending this time with me. If you're interested in the slide presentations, the lesson plans, the handouts, go to teachingwithpower.com and you'll find links to those resources. If you found the lesson helpful, please share it with those that you feel it could help. Thank you for watching. Now get out there and teach with power.